Now, in this week's Let's Talk Some Star Wars, we're going to be taking a look at the results of, and your comments from, the poll asking, how much do you miss George Lucas? And well, I don't think too many of you are going to be all that surprised by the results, where 80% of people say they either miss him quite a bit or immensely, with only 2% of people thinking Star Wars is better off without him. And another 11% saying that they understand it was time for the franchise to move on, which leaves 7% of people who say their feelings are a bit more complicated than any of those answers could say. And before we get into it, I will put up my usual disclaimer that those who watch my videos do tend to share my views and that it can influence the results. And since I have been rather critical of some, but certainly not all, of the things Disney has done with Star Wars, there's a good chance a more pro-Disney YouTube channel would get different results to this question. Though I don't know how much different, considering even if you've been completely happy with the Disney era of Star Wars, that doesn't mean you still can't or don't miss George Lucas. For example, and to get my bad analogy out of the way early, just because you're a 49ers fan who grew up watching Joe Montana, doesn't mean you can't miss him while you watched and enjoyed the Steve Young era. Anyway, let's now jump right into it with the top rated comment, which came to us from Crash Schwarzenegger, who said, I honestly miss George's creativity. The prequels, for how flawed they were, had so much creativity and emotion, plus the soundtrack was superb. And that's certainly something I've said before, and many others also brought it up in the comments this time, that the story behind the prequels, the creativity element, is fantastic. There's also some top-notch world building, and a story that really has some depth to it when you want to look for it. But the execution of that story, the quality of the movies themselves, well, just wasn't there. Especially when compared to The Empire Strikes Back, for example, which is not just a great Star Wars movie, but a masterpiece of filmmaking. But the thing about The Empire Strikes Back is that it wasn't just the product of George Lucas alone, as Chao Irito, and I hope I pronounced your name somewhat right, explains in the following comment. In comparison to the current creative team at Disney, he is very much missed. I would say, however, that Lucas did often need a guiding hand in many of his ideas, like Kirshner's direction, as well as Brackett and Kasdan's screenplay, helping vastly improve The Empire Strikes Back final product from what Lucas' initial idea was. The prequels are a good example of this, as whilst far better than the sequel trilogy thus far, they were still cases of great ideas with subpar execution, due to George having nobody there to give Lucas constructive criticism when it came to his script and direction. New Star Wars canon would have an absolute dream team if Lucas was at the helm of creative ideas and Dave Filoni as his assistant. Then there's what Drake Ford said here in his comment. George running rampant and surrounded by yes men generated some very real shortcomings. However, that man's passion and creativity were at the heart of the franchise. There is a tangible loss to be felt in his departure. In other words, if we sum up what both these comments are saying, it's basically that when Lucas had help and wasn't surrounded by people who just agreed with everything he said, we got The Empire Strikes Back. However, when Lucas did it all and those who surrounded him only nodded and smiled when he spoke, well, then we got The Phantom Menace. And look, I enjoy episode 1, I do, and I know there are a lot of people out there, mainly those who were younger when it came out, who do absolutely love that movie, and I think that's great. I don't want to take your childhood joy away from you. However, if we're being completely honest with ourselves here, it could have been much, much better. And one of the next videos I plan on doing, and I might even have it up tomorrow, is basically going to be how I would rework The Phantom Menace, or what suggestions I'd personally give to George Lucas if I could travel back in time and discuss it with him while he was making it. And no, I'm not trying to imply I could tell a better story or make a better movie than George Lucas, because I couldn't. Only that, especially with hindsight on my side, or knowing what worked and what didn't, that there are some changes that could be made to episode 1 that would have made for a much better movie overall. Okay, let's now move on to another comment, and this time it comes to us from My United States of What a Shame, who said, the prequels were flawed in that the acting was wooden, the dialogue could have used some improvements, the CGI in Attack of the Clones hasn't aged very well, and the fact that this all started over debates surrounding taxes is understandably off-putting. However, trimming off the fat and looking between the lines reveals a deep and rich story about a republic bloated with bureaucracy, how a Sith Lord trampled out the Jedi Order, and how a population weary of war willingly supported the rise of an authoritarian regime. Additionally, with George's blessing, people were allowed to build and expand upon the vast Star Wars universe, give it some depth, and see what could be done within the medium. While it certainly wasn't perfect, it gave room to experiment between content creators. As for Disney's management of the franchise, I haven't seen too much promise, whether it's their end game is to sell to kids, the fact that they've collectively become creatively bankrupt, have the financial mismanagement of a high schooler, or all of the above. It really seems that all they can do is regurgitate non-EU material, make the worst possible decisions in regards to who handles their property, and act completely hands-off when crap happens and hits the fan. And though there were a lot of interesting things said there, some you might agree with and some you might not, I think one of the things that's clear about Disney's handling of Star Wars, and they're already essentially acknowledging this, is their plan for Star Wars just flat out didn't work. And that plan, to put it very simply, was to not so much have any sort of shared vision or core creative team that dictated what stories should be told and by whom, but rather to bring in creative people to tell the stories they wanted to tell within this universe. And this ties into the Lucasfilm story group and what people don't seem to understand about them, that they're not the ones coming up with and driving the stories. And yeah, I can understand why people would think they are, considering the name seems to imply that's what they do. But instead what they actually do is basically listen to the ideas of others who want to create a Star Wars story for one medium or another, those being movies, shows, books, comics, games, and so on. And they first decide if the story itself fits the universe, that it'll be something that feels like Star Wars, if you will. And then they make sure that the story will fit into the continuity or canon and isn't something that's being worked on by someone else. In other words, they're kind of like traffic cops. They're not the ones driving the cars or stories. Instead, they're just giving green lights to some, red lights to other, and just trying to make sure nobody crashes into each other. And though in theory that sounds like a great way to get a lot of interesting and different stories told within the universe, I don't think it works anywhere near as well as, again, just having a central person or a small creative team that are the ones that are dictating what stories should be told and by whom. I mean, imagine if a small team of not just passionate Star Wars fans, but those with truly creative minds had gotten together to map out the entire sequel trilogy ahead of time, and then they went about seeking out people who could, well, bring that vision to fruition. If that had been the case, do you think there'd be more or less excitement for the upcoming Episode 9? Okay, now let's get to two more comments. The first one comes to us from the Arcadian Knight, who said, George understood his creation in a way that the current directorship simply does not, and without him, it has lost a lot of its soul. It's a bit like someone painting a Van Gogh, but they're not Van Gogh. And then this comment from Jacob Batashi, who said, I think George, with all his flaws, made Star Wars what it is. Made Star Wars feel like Star Wars. Disney doesn't. And to these two comments, I would say yes and no at the same time. Because let's remember, as I was basically saying a few minutes ago, there are a lot of people responsible for making Star Wars what it is today. Again, The Empire Strikes Back, arguably the best Star Wars movie, was not the work of just George Lucas alone. Far from it. In fact, if we're keeping it real, it was the movie he actually had the least impact on. However, what I think the problem is that Star Wars is missing his spark of creativity and imagination. And instead we have people taking his ideas for Star Wars and his characters and trying to reimagine them instead of trying to build something new that also honors what's always been. To many fans, right or wrong, it feels like the sequel trilogy is killing what Star Wars used to be in order to make it something different that isn't recognizable to them, instead of growing it with new concepts and ideas that enhance the previous ones George Lucas himself put in place. And as I've said many times before, if you're going to play in George's sandbox, especially in the very same area of it he was working in, which is the Skywalker saga, you better go out of your way to honor everything he's already built there, not knock it down and reshape the sand and claim you're directly continuing his story when you really aren't. Otherwise, a lot of fans aren't going to be happy, and it'll be Star Wars to them in name only, if even that. As I see it, the problem with the sequel trilogy for some fans, and I'm looking at The Last Jedi in particular here, isn't just that it subverted our expectations and tried something new and unexpected in the Star Wars galaxy or franchise. Hell, that's something fans would have likely been far more forgiving of if they'd done it in a new, separate trilogy, one that took place in either a distant part of the galaxy and or a different time period. But it didn't happen there. Rather, it took place within the ongoing Skywalker saga that is so synonymous with George Lucas that it's kind of hard to fathom that others are finishing it up without him right now. And instead of feeling like a natural progression of that story, of his story, it feels like a quick and unnecessary retelling of the first two trilogies. Because, as I've also said many times before, the prequels were all about the fall of the Jedi. The original trilogy was about the return of the Jedi, and the sequel should have been about the test of the Jedi, to see if their return can now withstand a new powerful threat. That way, when the new order Luke has built is ultimately victorious at the end of the sequels and endured this new incredible challenge, The whole saga could have ended with us knowing that the Jedi were likely going to endure for another 1,000 generations, as Obi-Wan once told Luke about. Instead, now the saga will presumably end with the Force in balance and Rey on the verge of rebuilding the Jedi Order or something like it. Just like Return of the Jedi used to be the end of the saga, where the Force was in balance and Luke presumably was on the verge of rebuilding a new order or something like it. Which makes you ask, what's the point of this trilogy other than to make Rey, a non-Skywalker, the last hero standing of the Skywalker saga? Though yes, they of course could do something different with the ending, but I'm not sure how much it'll deviate from that general idea I just mentioned. Whereas if Lucas made the sequel trilogy, he likely would have come up with a whole new idea for this final act of the story, yet one that would have connected with the previous two trilogies and carried them on, and that also would have put a final definitive stamp on the story that started with a slave boy from Tatooine named Anakin Skywalker, a character that, even though Star Wars is mainly his story, hardly seems to be part of this latest trilogy. The real problem, though, is it feels like instead of finding the story they wanted to tell first, and by they I mean anyone and everyone responsible for bringing this new trilogy to life, their main concern seemed to be who the main characters would be, and what do we do with Luke that he doesn't steal the spotlight from them. However, if you would have asked me what to do with Luke Skywalker, I simply would have answered, just let the story decide. In other words, whatever you come up with for the point of this whole trilogy, which again really should have been about testing the re-established Jedi Order, you just let Luke fall into whatever role he needed to be in, whatever felt most natural for him and makes sense for the character we last saw at the end of Return of the Jedi, which likely would have been the obvious one, as a Grand Master of the new Jedi Order he had rebuilt. And then Luke likely would have died at some point, maybe in battle or by sacrificing himself for his students, and maybe his own child or children and or a nephew or niece or two could have been among them. And then it would have been up to those he had trained, the next generation of the Skywalkers, to see if the Jedi Order, not to mention the New Republic, could endure this threat and carry on into the future. And no, I'm not saying the plot had to be quite that simple or generic. There certainly could have been a lot more to it, but it really should have been something along those lines in order to fit in and be a continuation of the overall story. Okay, I rambled on long enough there, so let's quickly get to one last comment here, and it comes to us from Jennifer LePage, who said, "The best thing about George Lucas was that he was a complete nutjob who got the job done by being the only guy crazy enough to put all his ideas out there and to run with them. Not all those ideas were very good, mind you, and he didn't exactly have some magic finger that allowed him to make great decisions about the content he was creating, but he did have a quality writing staff, more or less, a very competent team of actors and storyboard artists, and the resources to make his crazy dreams a reality. There's no reason Disney couldn't have those exact same things, and in terms of quality, they would only have to meet or exceed the precedent set by the prequel trilogy in order to make money and entertain an audience in order to keep Star Wars worth watching. Better yet, they'd far surpass the prequel trilogy and create a compelling narrative of their own, taking place in the Star Wars universe that was faithful to its predecessors and brought something new to the table. Obviously, that isn't what they're doing, though. Instead, they bank purely on the brand name to make a profit and send game and movie contracts to schmucks and hack writers thinking that their audience is too young or too stupid to not notice how lazy they are with their hard-earned intellectual properties. Star Wars doesn't need George Lucas, obviously. It needs passionate people to work on it, but Disney doesn't care and isn't trying at all. Now, that was probably one of the more enjoyable comments I read from this poll, mainly because of how candid and true her words were. Because, yeah, George Lucas was a little bit of a nutjob, and without him, nobody else probably ever makes anything quite like Star Wars, that took elements from so many different sources and made a movie about space wizards fighting with laser swords in a setting that was like the Old West meets outer space. And if he'd had the right people around him to rein him in when and where needed, perhaps the Star Wars prequels could have captured that same kind of magic that the original trilogy did, and they'd be held in the same high regard as the original trilogy, or at least much closer to it. And the thing is, as much love and respect as I have for George Lucas, I don't think it's impossible for others to give us a close approximation of his Star Wars, especially again when you consider how many people other than George Lucas helped make the original trilogy what it is, and how many imaginations he inspired with those movies who would love to honor his work today. Hell, the success of the expanded universe, which Lucas basically had no part of, is proof that others can do Star Wars free of him and do it well enough that the fans will love it. And I don't think there's an easy answer to explain why Disney has been missing the mark with so many fans in regards to Star Wars these days. I really don't think it's the absence of George Lucas, though yes, missing that unique creative spark of his does certainly hurt, but rather it's just having the wrong approach altogether, and not getting a core team in place who could drive the future stories of the franchise. Instead of having a story group in place that just plays traffic cop, create one that's made up of people who have truly been inspired by Lucas and want to honor his work as they drive it forward into the future. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought about what I or anyone else had to say in this video, or to share your ideas for a future poll. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.